Canada is going through a massive housing crisis right now, where people are simply unable to afford a home or place to live. This has been the single biggest discussion in Canadian politics for the past few years, and most Canadians feel that the primary reasons for housing crisis is because of the record number of immigrants in the country. However, I'm here to tell you that Canada's immigration policy is actually not the main reason why housing prices in Canada are so high. This is not a video defending Canada's immigration policy by any means. In fact, many Canadians want to cap immigration, and there are good arguments to be made about the flaws of Canada's immigration policy. But the point is that the high cost of housing is simply not one of them. Now, it's important to note that colloquially, Canadians use the term immigration and immigrants to refer to all types of migrants, including those who are considered non-permanent or temporary residents. An example of this would be people from India who entered Canada with a work or study permit. In fact, Canada's huge population increase is actually overwhelmingly driven by these non-permanent residents. Canada saw its biggest population growth of over 1 million people in 2022, and more than half of them were non-permanent residents. And it's important to make this distinction because oftentimes people, including those in the media, will use the term immigrants to refer to all types of new foreign residents in the country, even though a lot of them don't actually end up staying in Canada forever. The Canadian government actually compensates for the number of these non-permanent residents leaving by bringing more each year, which is why there is this constant increase in the number of people being allowed into Canada. But this should also change as Canada caps non-permanent resident population and makes it harder to acquire permanent residency and actually become immigrants, which is what we are beginning to see. This topic of Canada's immigration policy and the lack of affordable housing is such a big topic in Canadian politics that it will likely make or break the Liberal Party and its leader Justin Trudeau's chance at winning the next election. However, this is another time to pop any enthusiasm and say that the Conservative Party and its leader Pierre Poilievre likely won't fix or slow down the amount of migrants coming into the country either. For example, Poilievre wants what he calls a common sense immigration policy, where the number of people Canada lets in will be primarily tied to job vacancies.
My common sense policy on immigration will be driven by the number of vacancies that private sector employers want to fill.
For all my conservative friends out there, this is a red herring. The reason for this is that there's actually enough jobs already for everyone in Canada because, believe it or not, there's a labor shortage in the country. And there's a difference between job vacancy and job vacancy for desirable jobs, which Poilievre doesn't mention. Because most of these jobs are not going to pay enough for you to afford any decent quality of life, and jobs in general tend to be heavily concentrated in larger cities where housing is also unaffordable. And this is really the fundamental issue. The number one contributor to sky-high housing problem in Canada is low-density single-family housing, specifically suburbia, alongside the lack of good public transportation system with a very car-reliant mode of transportation. As long as the majority of Canadians aren't willing to let go of living in a suburban single-family housing, the housing problem will never be resolved. Just take a look at this map of Toronto, where 62.3% of residential land zones are exclusively for single-family homes. And then you have Vancouver, where 80.5% of residential land zones are exclusively for single-family homes. Then you have Montreal, where only 45.8% of residential land zones are for single-family homes. Unsurprisingly, the higher the percentage of residential land zones are for single-family homes, the more expensive the real estate market is. Vancouver and Toronto are significantly more expensive than Montreal for this reason. In Toronto, around 2 million or 39% of occupied private dwellings were single detached homes in 2021. This means that 39% of private dwellings, which are made up of single detached home, is occupying more than 60% of Toronto land. They don't even release how many properties in Vancouver are single dwelling houses anymore, but we do have this really weird article from Globe and Mail back in 2016 called The Vancouver's Myth of Single Family House, stating that only 15% of private dwellings in Vancouver are single-family housing, all while conveniently leaving out the part that this supposed only 15% of private dwellings are occupying more than 80% of Vancouver land. The sizes of these homes will vary, but they will generally range from 6,000 square feet to more newer buildings, which is around 4,000 square feet. Replacing these homes with row houses or multifamily buildings, like the ones you see in this picture, means that you can effectively double, triple, or even quadruple the amount of private dwellings in the same land size. This means that even turning half of these single-family homes, like picture A, which dominates majority of Canadian cities, to just medium-density housing like you see in picture B, is enough to accommodate all migrants coming into Canada from 2016 to 2021 combined, all in the same land size. But the point is that these single-family homes are actually incredibly inefficient use of land. And we haven't even considered things like condos or apartment buildings, which would help tremendously. Transforming many of these single detached homes into anything but single detached homes can actually solve the Canadian housing crisis altogether. The worst part of all this is that Canada actually builds these homes because this is really the only type of housing that is allowed by law to be built in many of these neighborhoods. Of course, there will still be people who want to live in a house with a big yard, with lots of spaces away from neighbors in a single family home. And that's perfectly fine, but not everyone, especially young people, care about living in a suburban neighborhood. And although it's fine that single detached homes exist, they should not be the majority, especially in or near city centers. What's really interesting is that in places like Quebec, where housing prices are cheaper for their city sizes, you can see way more utilization of mixed-use development. I've already mentioned that Montreal is cheaper than other cities because it isn't dominated by single-family housing. And to be exact, Montreal real estate is 20 to 40% cheaper than other major cities in Canada. Meanwhile, it doesn't have this degradation of living quality that people expect with less single-family housing. Lack of single-family housing doesn't mean everyone has to live in some kind of coffin homes. And I would actually argue that Montreal and Quebec in general is one of the best places to live in Canada, precisely because they've done a much better job of building up their cities. And the only reason why more people don't live there is because nobody wants to learn French. Housing prices are driven by supply and demand. When there is a high demand but low supply, prices skyrocket. To put it simply, if hundreds of people want to buy or rent your house, it means that your house is valuable and the cost of house will reflect that value. Whereas if nobody wants to buy or rent your house, it means that your house is not valuable and you will have to decrease the price of the house if you want somebody to be interested. Currently in Canada, there is a low supply or not enough homes due to single-family housing zones taking up all the land spaces. Meanwhile, there's a high demand because lots of people, including migrants, are looking to buy or rent homes, which means that the value of home prices will naturally soar up as the demand is fierce, with individuals and companies who are more than willing to pay higher prices for these homes outbidding the average Canadians. Now, hold on a second, doesn't having more migrants cause demands to be high? So we should stop accepting people to slow down the demands while the supply catches up then? There's actually a couple of problems with this argument. First is that supply is actually driven by demand. So if you get rid of the demand by stopping the acceptance of migrants into Canada, the market will also react by slowing down the supply. Because the reason why the market builds the supply in the first place is because there is demand. So if you stop bringing migrants to Canada, at first there might be few condos that go up to fulfill the demands of the existing migrants and residents. But once that dries up, the construction of those condos will stop because there will no longer be enough money flowing in for the market to be incentivized to build more houses. Then, once you open the door back up to foreigners again, the cycle continues with sudden uptick in demands and lack of supply, thus the prices skyrocketing once more. So this is really the band-aid solution that doesn't address the underlying problems. In fact, it's not a coincidence that Canada right now has more cranes up than multiple US cities combined, and this is largely driven by the demands. Well, if that's the case, shouldn't we at least slow down the acceptance of migrants to a point where supply can catch up without it pricing people out of housing, without necessarily having to stop migration policy? There's also a couple of problems with this. Let's say you own a fast food hamburger restaurant and there's a high demand for your hamburgers, but you don't have enough of it. The ideal thing to do here isn't to slow down the demands by reducing the number of customers. It's actually to open up more chains, hire more people, and create more hamburgers to increase the supply in order to meet the demands. And this is also how you expand your business and make more money as well. Likewise, if there's a high demand for real estate but you don't have enough of it, the ideal thing to do here isn't to slow down the demands by reducing the number of migrants from coming into the country. Instead, the ideal thing to do here is to speed up and build more apartments and condos. And this is also how you expand your economy and generate wealth as well. In fact, if you slow down the demands by restricting migrants coming in, you're pretty much foregoing a lot of the economic benefits all because you couldn't just build more homes. Just like a restaurant owner who forgoes all the potential money he can make by restricting customers because he was just too stupid to hire more people and open more restaurants. Canada can build more homes to meet the demands. It's just that the ability to build is being heavily stifled by zoning laws and building restrictions and all sorts of government red tapes. Think about it this way, there's actually nothing that can go wrong with building more homes, whereas things could potentially go wrong if you stop or even slow down migration. When you just compare the two options, it makes no sense not to pick the decision to just build more homes. What about the fact that there are so many foreigners who don't live in Canada that are buying up property? Isn't that also a problem? Not only that, but a lot of these homes are empty. Home vacancy rate in Canada is actually very low. This idea that there are rich foreigners buying up houses and leaving them empty isn't actually true. Additionally, Canada has tried to ban foreign investments into property, and in all cases, this has actually failed. This shouldn't have been surprising because many experts already knew that this wouldn't work because it fails to address the underlying issue of supply. Of course, the average Canadians competing with mega corporations and rich people for housing is most definitely a problem, but this again is just a symptom of the lack of supply. The point is that Canadians are competing with these companies in a market where there are barely enough desirable homes because all the ones near actual jobs and other amenities are hoarded by single-family homes. Additionally, you actually want rich people investing into your market because it can encourage development of cities and infrastructure around the investment, which ultimately is a good thing for the Canadian economy. A lot of people just aren't aware of the economic benefits because they don't see the immediate effect of foreign investment into the country, which goes to transforming Canada in the long run. There are a lot of unnecessary and complicated suggestions that get thrown around when discussing how to tackle the Canadian housing market, but it actually isn't that complicated because this challenge is a challenge that's been talked about by so many experts and so many countries have and are experiencing this. You don't actually need to reinvent the wheel. Single-family housing zone is the biggest contributor to the Canadian housing crisis. They are incredibly inefficient and frankly speaking takes up way too much space. Canada needs more multi-family and multi-purpose buildings. Jobs also tend to be heavily concentrated in one area, typically the heart of downtown. And the dominance of single-family housing in those areas means that everything also becomes spread out, causing more car dependency. The coverage and quality of public transportation in many parts of Canada is suboptimal, and it's frankly speaking a very difficult country to live without owning a car. And for people who might not want to drive to work, the only option they have is to look for a place near downtown, which also drives up the cost of the area as well. There's a reason why when you look at cities around the world with decent affordable housing, they all have one thing in common: the lack of single-family housing unit and amazing public transportation system that creates even development across the provinces. And again, this doesn't mean that you have to live in a shoebox. It just means that there needs to be a better balance. Everything I said might not be the sexiest answer, but single-family housing zones will likely have to be reduced a lot if Canadians want to create an environment where housing is affordable. And the truth is that every one of your favorite politicians know what everything I said in my video to be true. This is why we're seeing some of the largest changes to single-family housing zones throughout Canada. This is why the Conservatives' actual solution to housing crisis is to speed up the ability to acquire building permits and reduce its costs in order to quickly get construction of supply going.
And will require every federally funded transit station have high-density apartments built all around and sometimes even on top of the stations, so our youth and our seniors don't even need to have a car. They can live right next to the bus and train.
His whole talk about restricting immigration is a lip service to his voter base. This is also the reason why Justin Trudeau is beginning to allow more housing to be built through financial incentives and also removing the barriers for homes to be built.
There is a need for greater densification. There's a need for ability to shift zoning more rapidly. There is a need to look at red tape and how we can accelerate processes within municipal structures. And all that needed investments and support so that municipalities and councils could actually tackle the big changes, the structural changes in processes and zoning and densification that would lead to unlocking the housing needs that we had to meet in the coming years. So that's where we put forward a $4 billion housing accelerator fund to do just that.
In fact, almost every single one of your major political parties and their platform is to significantly increase the supply. All these parties will virtue signal about Canada's immigration policy one way or the other, but they all know it's always been about the supply. I also want Canadians to know that their housing problem is not unique to the country. High cost of housing is something that is plaguing a lot of countries. And everything has failed except one thing: increase the supply by building good cities with efficient land use, jobs, and public transportation. And this is something that Canadians will have to accept if they want to address the housing problem.